last 2 weeks, Russian politicians have said it's time to make it clear that we're going to seize control of Kharkov and Odessa. Well, that's been clear from the beginning. If you're going to declare war on us, which is what we've effectively said to Russia, then we're going to retake everything that is ours historically, and that's what they're going to do. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it. The most recent indications I have is that the Ukrainians have lost somewhere between 450 and 500,000 dead. Now, the Ukrainians have been fighting for less than 2 years, perhaps 19 months, 20 months, and they've lost 500,000 dead. We don't know how many are casualties, but the numbers are overwhelming. The hospitals are full. The numbers of amputees are staggering. A lot of these people are dying on the battlefield because there's no means to evacuate them. If a Ukrainian soldier or officer is wounded, he's got to bribe people in the ambulance to take him to a hospital to be cared for. The entire Ukrainian state has broken down. If you want to know what a failed state is, look at Ukraine. Meanwhile, Washington has turned Ukraine into the 51st state, lavishing billions and billions and billions of dollars on the state. We pay for the bureaucracy, for the daily government, for everything that you can imagine. You and other Europeans have contributed to the military side, as we have, but we effectively own Ukraine, and Americans have said, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? We don't do as much for our own people as we are doing for Ukraine. And then, of course, there's always Israel. Israel is always quietly mentioned as the 51st state. Well, Ukraine has long since eclipsed Israel. Israel is a minor expense compared to what's happening in Ukraine. And then you get the argument, well, for about 5% of your defense budget, and remember, our defense budget is very close to $1 trillion. If you throw in the intelligence communities, it is $1 trillion. That this is somehow a bargain because they are killing Russians for us. Nonsense. They haven't killed very many Russians at all. Russian losses are very low because the Russians have decided if you're stupid enough to attack us in our defenses, we'll annihilate you. And that's what they've been doing since really January of this year. Ukrainians are largely running out of manpower, which is why they're trying to convince the EU and other countries that have taken in Ukrainian refugees to send back men of military age because they've run out. The average age in the Ukrainian army is over 40 or under 21, under 18. This is ridiculous. The whole thing is over. The war is ending. However, we are sustaining it as long as possible with cash because we want to make it clear to people that this is real when it's not real. Ukraine is a fantasy. So what are the next steps? I've watched over the last few months as the Russians have added 300 kilometers of additional rail line into eastern Ukraine. I've watched the buildup of forces. They are now over 1 million men in the Russian army, and they're going to be even larger over the next few months. This is an unmistakable buildup that has serious consequences for the future of Ukraine. So I think we're going to see the Russians take the territory that we've mentioned, and then they're going to look for someone with common sense in Eastern Europe or Western Europe or Northern Europe to sit down and talk with them so that they can hammer out a solution, because what the Russians don't want, and this is very clear, they don't want to govern Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine really is different from Russia, and people that have studied it for centuries know that. It was a different heritage, different gene pool. They want nothing to do with it. But they cannot sit by and allow the West, led by the United States, to turn the future Ukraine into yet another platform for attack against Russia, which means that whatever state, rump state, if you will, emerges in Western Ukraine, it's got to be neutral. It can't be part of the alliance. Now, the last point is very important about the alliance, because I think the NATO alliance is crumbling. You have this facade of stability. It's not stable. The Germans are in terrible turmoil. They've now tried to kill some of their right-of-center politicians. I know it's popular for the neocons and the globalists to refer to the alternative for Germany as radical right. That's absurd. Anybody who's spending time with these people, you know, they're just right of center at best. They are ultimately going to wield power in Berlin, and the stops are being pulled out to try and prevent that. It's not going to work. You have a similar phenomenon in France. At some point, that state is going to fundamentally change for the same reason that we will in the near future. And that's economics and finance. You have something you call gilts. I think we call them treasuries. I would urge everyone to look at the United States Treasury market. Look at the long-term Treasury bonds. The yields are now at 4.8%. Once they reach 5, I'm reliably told by analysts, our entire financial system could implode. We cannot service the debt. We can't afford it. Remember, there's this old question, when did the British leave India? They left India when the debt to GDP ratio after World War II, thanks to Churchill's brilliant strategy, was 240%. The British left because they were broke. They destroyed themselves in the Second World War. I have to admit, I'm an old Corelli Barnett fan. My first concern, had I been British, would have been the preservation of British national power in the empire. And that critical point was lost. Britain bankrupted itself. And so people made the prudent decision in 1947 to evacuate India, along with most of the empire. The thing that had propped up Britain as a very prosperous world power was suddenly a fire sailed out of existence overnight. I think something similar is going to happen to us. And I think you're going to see massive troop withdrawals from all over the world as we run into a very serious financial crisis. Now, that's not a popular view inside the Beltway. People in the Beltway all think, oh, no, we can continue to print money in perpetuity. Don't worry about it. The Federal Reserve can buy up all the treasuries we need. Well, I'm telling you that's not going to happen. We're going to be in real trouble. And I think when that happens, it doesn't matter what people say about Ukraine. No one in the United States will care, and the United States will not care what the allies think. Washington will do whatever it thinks it is in its own interest, and that will mean leaving Ukraine. So the war will end when we leave. We just cut it off, walk away, it's done. And until then, I suppose in some form it will drag on, and we'll watch the Russians incrementally move across eastern Ukraine and finally into Odessa. Whether that happens before we fall apart or after, I don't know, but it will happen. And then hopefully people on the European continent will step in, new governments in Berlin, Paris, Prague, Warsaw, elsewhere, and negotiate an end to this insanity. But that will not forge, Godfrey, an enduring peace. It will give us a break for some period of years. War will return in some form on a limited basis. But, the notion that we're going to ever achieve eternal peace in Eastern Europe, I think, is totally unrealistic.
You mentioned a lot of names there. I've had the pleasure of meeting Corelli Barnett, and of course I don't know whether you had any dealings with Professor Norman Stone as well, who takes very much your view, and incidentally very much my view, which is desperately unfashionable. Even now, yes, that Norman Stone's view basically, and there's another professor whose name escapes me for the moment, but I said, yes, I mean, the one remit that Churchill had was to save the British Empire. And that's what he probably failed to do. But of course, I'm sure you would agree with me too, and I've subject on which I lecture and write sometimes, and that is, of course, there was only one war, as my grandfather said, who was injured on the Messines Ridge in 1917. And I once said to him, I mentioned World War II, and he grunted over his newspaper at me, and he said, there was only one war, boy, and it came in two parts. And of course, I'm a big subscriber to that particular view. And as for the...
Yeah, I think that's true. And historically, that's not unusual. Very few wars end in a very decisive way. World War II did. Unfortunately, it left us all in the West in a terrible position. We did not win the war. Stalin did. Communism did. When the war ended, all you have to do, when I was teaching at West Point, I used to pull down a map of Europe in 1939, have everybody look at it for a few minutes, comment on it, and then I went over and pulled down the map of 1945, where all the armies stood. And I said, now, who won the Second World War? And finally, some cadet in the front row would say, Sir, the Soviet Union. I said, yes, we didn't win a damn thing. Now, you got to remember, though, and I don't know if many of your countrymen are aware of this, but FDR actually, and I thought he was a catastrophe, took the position that Stalin's totalitarian state that had murdered tens of millions of people long before the Second World War broke out was morally superior to the British Empire. And he left no opportunity unexploited to undermine Britain. And I don't know if your countrymen understand that. It was a catastrophe.
Well, certainly people of my ilk certainly do. That's, of course, he insisted on no repayment from the Soviet Union, but the repayment of Lend-Lease and so on and so forth. And of course, the irony is, one might argue now, with the benefit of hindsight, one might argue that he wanted to get rid of the British Empire so the Americans could have their empire, which I think if you look at a map now and you look at bases and overseas military personnel and political influence, you could argue it's another empire round about the same size if you look at a map from as almost the old British Empire was. The difference is, of course,
I would tell you, Godfrey, that may well have been in the back of FDR's mind, but it was never in the backs of the minds of the senior military leaders, because I can tell you that whenever there was a conference involving the senior military leadership of Great Britain with the Americans, that the Americans came to it woefully unprepared. The British would walk in with maps of the world that identified every port, every airfield, every oil well, every mine, because the British at least had some idea of what they wanted the world to look like when the war ended. We didn't. We just